11 of the war in Israel. So let's get into it. We open with the barrage of missiles launched from Iran in 4 or 5 waves this morning. Millions of Israelis were forced to shelter all over the country. There were no reports of injuries, and several of the impacts were reported in open areas. One impact was next to a power station in southern Israel. Outages were reported in nearby towns. And the Israel Electric Corporation said the impact was near a strategic infrastructure facility. Teams were on the ground making repairs. We go now to ILTV's Shosh Bedrosian in Tel Aviv. Shosh, what can you tell us about today's missile barrages?
Sure. So we know that sirens sounded, I believe, around 9 a.m. this morning, Lidar. It was a relatively, I would say, night. There was only one siren that went off in the central Israel area around 3:15 a.m. Sometimes there's so many alarms you can't even remember how many of them went off, but we know that around 3:15 a.m. one went off, and around 9 a.m. Did not really impact central Israel, but it really did impact the north of Israel, in addition to the Golan Heights, the Haifa area, and also in Ashdod. What you're looking at on your screen right now is one of the impacts. Look how large it is. On the side of this road, you can see the debris flying across the street, the highway here, the large plume of smoke. This is just one of the impacts that was made. We don't know necessarily how many in total. We know that it did hit near Ashdod, specifically this location that you're seeing on your screen right now. So it's unclear, though, because we do know also Israel is reporting that there was some type of strategic electrical facility that had damage sustained to it because of one of these direct hits, but no injuries were reported, which was great news compared to yesterday, where we had major damage inside of Ramat Aviv, where more than 20 people were injured. So as you can see, different types of impacts, and today's impacts did not necessarily affect civilians immediately, which is all good news. Vidar?
And we're seeing very few missiles launched in the latest barrages. The missile launch that you mentioned at 3 a.m., that was a lone missile that, sent millions of Israelis into bomb shelters in the middle of the night. But just one missile that was also successfully intercepted. But, we're seeing very few missiles, but increasingly more impacts. I mean, why is that?
Yeah, so we've been looking into this a lot. First responders on the ground of these impacted sites, specifically on residential homes, have told us that the velocity of the missiles are just so intense and they create such severe damage. They somehow evade the system. And right now, of course, we've heard reports, and we've actually heard from the IDF, that some of these ballistic missiles are carrying multiple warheads, and more munitions and fragments are being dropped from these types of ballistic missiles. So it could likely be from that lidar. You mentioned that one ballistic missile was fired at around 3:15 a.m. at Israel this morning. And today, the 4 waves of attacks that happened in this morning's barrage of missiles had about 10 that were fired at Israel. So sure, you can say Israel's receiving less ballistic missiles, but it's the same thing that happened last week. And the first attack that happened after the United States struck 3 of the nuclear centers inside of Iran, there were 30 ballistic missiles that did make serious impact. About 3 of them made serious impact inside of Israel yesterday. So it's unclear if the number going down reflects something, because Israel experienced the last, less missiles also last week, and then all of a sudden 30 ballistic missiles were fired at Israel just yesterday. So I'm not sure if the numbers mean something. And I think the way that I'm reporting and the way that I'm going about this is, there could be more missiles coming at Israel within the next few days. It's unclear, and it's hard to determine why at this moment. But we do know the IDF is specifically targeting a lot of these missile launchers. They said they have actually struck about 50% of them. So what does that mean in terms of how many ballistic missiles are being fired at Israel? It's unclear what the number really means. Of course, it's probably less than what their capabilities were before this operation inside of Iran began. But in terms of the future, of course, we're still waiting to see what will happen.
Absolutely. So a lot of uncertainty here in Israel. And so I do want to ask you a little bit about the atmosphere, the mood in Tel Aviv right now with all this uncertainty sort of in the air.
Yeah. So I actually was just at an underground bomb shelter. It's actually a parking garage 4 floors below. And what you're looking at right now is a Shabbat that was actually held there just the other day. But people are really camping out there. Well, I'm doing a full report on this for our main broadcast that will air around 8 o'clock Israel time. And you will be able to see all of the tents that are in this parking garage. People are living there. And some woman told me today that I interviewed, she plans on staying there until this operation, until this conflict with Iran is finished, because many people do not have protected spaces inside of their homes, not even in their buildings. This woman I spoke with is from Bat Yam. She had no protected space in her apartment there. So she went to her friend's home in Petah Tikva. And while she was there, they experienced a direct hit on their building. So now she's living with her dog inside of this shelter, which is a parking garage in central Israel underneath a mall, and she is just holding out until this escalation, decreases. So the threat is away. You know, a lot of people fear what could happen. So many people live without these protected spaces. We know that 2.6 million people in Israel do not have shelters to go to. So it's a big topic in Israel, especially because we know these protected spaces, Lidar, are really saving lives. Yesterday, we were in Ramat Aviv, and we saw pure devastation, debris everywhere from a direct Iranian ballistic missile hit there. And it's a miracle. Officials say that people, all of them, nearly ran to their miklats, their shelters in their basements, and all of them were saved. You know, there were only pretty much moderate, minor injuries that came out of that, when their entire facade of the building in Ramat Aviv came crumbling down from the impact of that direct strike. So we know how important these mamads are, these bomb shelters, any type of protected space, which is definitely a big conversation here in Israel. We're going on to our 2 weeks since this operation inside of Iran began, with Iran targeting civilian areas directly. And so it's a matter of how people will continue to live their lives. We know Homefront Command has, limited some activities here as well, but life still goes on. You know, the streets are still decently busy. No enormous gatherings, but people are going to cafes, living their lives, working from home, and that's how it is here right now.
Shosh, thank you so much for the report. And stay safe in Tel Aviv. And moving on, renewed Israeli airstrikes in Iran on strategic sites, including on the Fordow nuclear facility, following yesterday's U.S. strikes. Reports coming out of Iran indicate that Israel bombed Tehran's notorious Evin Prison. Defense Minister Israel Katz released a statement moments ago saying that the IDF is currently striking with unprecedented force regime targets and governmental repression bodies in the heart of Tehran. He confirmed the strike on Evin Prison. This is a prison that houses political prisoners, journalists, academics, and human rights activists who oppose the regime. So very symbolic target. Videos circulating on social media show the moment of impact. And Katz also named other targets, including the Israel clock in Palestine Square. It's a major symbolic landmark for the regime. It's a clock that counts down what it describes as the destruction of Israel by 2040. And Katz also confirmed strikes on the internal security headquarters of the Revolutionary Guards, the ideology headquarters, and other regime targets. And joining us now with more on day 11 of the war is Rabbi Rafael Shore, producer of the film Iranium and author of Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jew. Raphael, thank you so much for joining us at this hour.
A pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
So you're in Israel now for the duration of this war. I want to ask, before we get into it, what's it been like for you these past 11 days?
Well, I live in Jerusalem in the heart. This is my home. This is not my first rodeo. I have been living through a lot of these wars and events for the past 30 years. And it is incredibly scary. It's incredibly intense. And at the same time, there's something very special, I would say almost spiritual, going on when the Jewish people are faced with enemies and we have to unite and come together. it is a very special time, and especially now we're seeing incredible miracles as the tables have been turned on our enemies. So it's actually an inspiring time.
Now, you are a producer of the film Iranium, and I know this is a film that came out years ago, and it was a warning about the Iranian nuclear threat. This was a threat that was largely ignored by the international community for years, or at least, they followed somewhat of a policy of appeasement. So, two questions here. First of all, when the film initially came out, maybe it was ahead of its time, we could say. What was the response to the film? And now, in light of this, how do you view Israel's and the U.S.'s actions that they finally took against the Iranian nuclear threat?
Yeah, it was denial for the most part. But at the same time, in my career, I've made 20 documentary films, about half of them about anti-Semitism and alerting the West about the threat of radical Islam. And this one in particular was probably the time I got most scared, because in Canada, there was going to be a major screening at the Parliament in Canada, and there was a bomb threat that they linked to the Iranian regime, and that caused a cancellation of the event. To Canada's credit, at that time, they probably had a stronger pro-Israel government at that time than they do now, and they made a big issue out of it, and they caused it to be a cause célèbre. The film was also featured by Sean Hannity. Fox News was on the job. But overall, I would say, despite the fact that 150 million people have seen my films, and that includes Obsession, Radicalism's War Against the West, overall, it was a difficult educational process to try to get people to understand the nature of the threat, despite the fact that the ideas were very clear in these films.
And do you think that today there's more sort of awareness of this threat, especially, I'm going to say, amongst, the West, because you've spent, as you said, several decades now, educating people about the threats of radical Islam, about jihadism. And, I want to ask, because we're seeing a lot of support for U.S. and Israeli strikes in the Middle East, support for Israel, from Middle Eastern countries, but less so from Western countries, among democratic and liberal leaders and students on college campuses who are actually siding with Hamas, siding with Hezbollah, siding with the Iranian regime. I mean, how do you explain this?
Well, this is exactly what my recent film is about, called Tragic Awakening, A New Look at the Oldest Hatred, which is based on my book. This is my first book, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jew? And what it basically shows is that the anti-Semitism at its root is a civilizational issue. It is a fight over moral systems and value systems. So the fight against the Jewish people is always an issue of what values are the people standing for. So today, in this fight, first of all, starting from October 7th, and now with the fight against Iran, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of lack of moral clarity, and especially in the campuses, and the ability to understand that it's Western values versus barbaric anti-civilization values. There's confusion over that. But at the core, this is something that the battle that Israel is fighting today against Hamas, against Hezbollah, against Iran, is a battle for Western civilization. And the Jewish people are always first. We're the canary in the coal mine. And it's because we stand for these deep civilizational values about the sanctity of life and humanitarianism. And somehow deep down the world, the anti-Semites understand it. And it shows the relevance of the Jewish people in every generation. So the Jewish people, my message is that we should stand strong, because the fact that so many evil empires are trying to hurt us and kill us once again, the radical Islamists have taken over from the Nazis in this generation, proves our importance, proves our relevance, and therefore we should embrace these values. And I think that, thank God, a lot of Americans and a lot of Western thinkers, and even a lot of people in the Middle East, do appreciate today that Israel is on the front lines of helping the world become a more civilized and humanitarian place. And this is a civilizational war. We hear a lot about the confused people. They make a lot of noise, but I do believe that the majority of humanity has our backs. And thank God this week we saw that the American administration does as well.
Mm-hmm. And, you mentioned the new book that you recently published, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jews? Can you tell us a little bit more about this book?
Yeah, well, we tend to take for granted the fact that there's an Iranian regime and a Hamas regime that wants to commit genocide, that it's part of their constitution. You just mentioned the Israel clock in Tehran. I didn't even know about that. But we take it for granted that there's these nations and empires that want to do genocide on the Jewish people. And we don't give a lot of thought to why. What's the root of it, and why does it happen in every single generation? And that's the question that I explore in the book. And I present a very surprising answer to that question, one that goes against conventional wisdom. And the proofs that I bring come from the most unlikely source, which is the ideology of Adolf Hitler. And I present his ideology, and he understood who the Jewish people were in a deep way. We have not been presented this in our educational system, but he was very clear. He understood that the Jewish people represented these humanitarian values and God and light and making the world a better place. But he stood for survival of the fittest, might makes right, etc. And he understood this is the clash of human civilization, and the Jews are enemy number one, and they must be destroyed. And that's why he wanted to carry out genocide. That mission has continued from before Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and continues today, being led by the Iranian radical Islamist regime, once again trying to wipe out these values from the world. We stand for the sanctity of life. They stand for death. We stand for humanitarianism and concern. They stand against it. We stand for freedom, and they stand against it. And so it's a clash of values. And that's what I present in the book. But I present the reason for anti-Semitism, not just to explain it, although that's very interesting, but really in order to give the Jewish people and those who stand with us moral self-confidence. Because after 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, the Jewish people have lost it a little bit. And we've forgotten a little bit about who we are and what we stand for. And the book presents a very strong case of our importance and the justice of who we are, and that if we embrace these values and we love who we are, we will have the strength to stand against the anti-Semites of the world, and we will be able to continue our mission of bringing light into the world. So it's actually a very inspirational book designed to help people have stronger clarity on what the world is about.
So a fascinating take. Who's afraid of the Big Bad Jew? Rabbi Rafael Shore, thank you so much for joining us today and for your insights.
My pleasure.
And moving on, a day after the U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, U.S. President Donald Trump is now hinting at regime change in the Islamic State. In social media posts, President Trump questioned the possibility of regime change, saying it's not politically correct to use the term, but the current Iran regime is unable to make Iran great again, so why wouldn't there be regime change? And in a separate post, Trump claimed that the U.S. strikes had caused monumental damage to Iran's nuclear sites. He posted, "Obliteration is an accurate term. The biggest damage took place far below ground level," adding the word bullseye. Meanwhile, hours after the U.S. attack on Iran, Prime Minister Netanyahu went to the highly symbolic Western Wall in Jerusalem's Old City, where he placed a note in the cracks saying, "A person that rises up as a lion lifts himself up." Later, Netanyahu said that he knew about the U.S. strikes on Iran at least 24 hours in advance of the attack. And speaking after President Trump, he said the U.S. had obliterated Iran's key nuclear sites, saying that U.S. involvement brought Israel closer to its war goals. The prime minister said Israel is willing to end the bombing campaign in Iran if the Islamic Republic agrees to dismantle its nuclear program. And Netanyahu said Israel will achieve its goals and avoid a war of attrition with Iran. And so joining us now with more from Jerusalem is ILTV's Editor-in-Chief Steve Liebowitz. Steve, a lot to cover. Let's start with the latest IDF strikes on the Iranian regime targets. This seems to indicate a bit of a shift. Is the IDF now going after the regime itself? Is it seeking to push regime change with these strikes?
It's almost as though Donald Trump says regime change and the IDF airplanes head to political targets in Tehran. I don't know if it was by chance. Perhaps Netanyahu heard the comments by Trump and put in a request to the IDF chief and said, let's start hitting regime targets. Maybe it is possible to help encourage the end of days for Ali Khamenei and the Ayatollahs. And hitting the prison of all the political prisoners in the center of Tehran, that is quite a symbolic move.
Absolutely. Well, we do know that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Donald Trump have had unprecedented cooperation throughout this entire operation. Now, I want to talk a little bit, as the dust settles on the U.S. strikes against Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, what can you tell us about the damages? U.S. leadership, Trump is hailing this as a major success. Has the U.S. essentially managed to wipe out Iran's nuclear program?
Well, that remains to be seen. I've heard the claims. I have not seen the proof. Maybe the proof will emerge. I imagine more likely what happened is that the nuclear program has been set back quite a bit. There was quite a lot of damages caused, certainly in Fordow and in the other nuclear facilities. Israel's been causing most of the damage, but what the United States came and did with its bullseye, as Donald Trump calls it, is certainly taking out the nuclear ambitions of the Iranians, at least trying to set them back. It hasn't happened yet. And Israel is continuing to attack now, mostly launchers. And as we just spoke about, that we've also been attacking symbols of the government. So herein lies the problem, Lidar. We could be facing a war of attrition. We're now in the 11th day. Every day we're woken up. Every day there are injuries. Some days there are fatalities. Thousands of people have lost their homes. So the Israeli population, most of the victims, of course, are civilians, but the Israeli population is under attack. It's a war of attrition against us into the 11th day. If it continues like this, the airspace remains closed, the schools remain closed, a lot of the economy remains closed, and it's very, very damaging to Israel. And that's why Netanyahu already today spoke about he will not allow a war of attrition. This has to end quickly, hopefully by regime change. That would be great. Or potentially by a political deal between the U.S. and Iran that's a really good deal about the nukes and accomplishes Israel's goals, or a war of attrition, because the Ayatollah is not going to simply give up. If he can find an off-ramp, he might take it eventually, but that could take some time.
And that is the dilemma, because we do know that the Iranian regime will sign a deal, shake the West's hand, but with the other hand will continue rebuilding its nuclear capabilities. Now, I want to go back for 1 second to the U.S. role in this war. The U.S. had an unprecedented historic strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, but will the U.S. continue helping in the war? Or was this a one-time strike? As you said, we saw Trump's tweet hinting at the possibility of regime change. I mean, what's your assessment of the U.S.'s role moving forward?
Well, let's make no mistake. From the beginning, the U.S. was helping in the war. It's U.S. arms, U.S. munitions, it's U.S. planes and it's U.S. political support, political backing, and it's some air defense provided by the United States. Now there are aircraft carriers in the region moved into place. The U.S. has already entered into the fray. They're not saying that they're going to continue strikes, but I wouldn't be surprised if some days down the road, maybe 2 weeks, like Trump has been saying, and there's no movement towards, the capitulation and or the complete surrender of the Iranians, like he's been calling for, or regime change. Then I could see the United States launching yet another wave of attacks in coordination with Israel. By the way, in the last wave, Israeli planes opened the way, knocked out extra anti-aircraft units that were blocking the way for the Americans. The American forces asked us to take them out before they went in and did the job at Fordow and elsewhere.
So, going back, that's the main question now is what is Israel's exit strategy for this war? We mentioned one possibility is regime change. The other possibility would essentially be a war of attrition or some kind of, I guess we could call it, arrangement like Israel had with Hamas, where there would be periods of quiet and then there would be cycles of, violence, cycles of conflict.
I think Lidar, it'll be closer to an agreement like we worked out with Hezbollah in Lebanon after a war of back and forth over there, and with an Israeli invasion, and now there's a ceasefire with Israel basically pulled out except for certain locations, and we still operate freely inside Lebanon. I think Israel could look for some kind of an agreement, with Iran, that's brokered by the United States at some point down the line. Because there has to be some kind of a political agreement of some sort on some level that's respected by both sides. Otherwise, what you have by definition is a war of attrition or a continuing war. I don't know that the Israeli government has yet figured out the next step, and I'll tell you why. I mean, for 20 years or so, the prime minister, quite rightly, has been speaking about the danger of Iranian nuclear weapons and about the importance of stopping them. Well, so according to the United States, those weapons have been obliterated. So we have stopped them. What's the next step? I'm not sure if anyone knows, not the United States and not Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Mm-hmm. Well, Steve, we do know, we're almost out of time, but I just want to mention that we do know that the Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, just concluded a press conference, so we'll have more details on that in the coming hour. Steve Liebowitz, ILTV's Editor-in-Chief, thank you so much for your insights and analysis today.
Pleasure.
So we are getting word that from the press conference, just a few of the highlights that we're getting word of, that the Crown Prince said he's not seeking political power, but is creating a formal channel for military and police in Iran if they want to break with the regime and join his movement to create democracy, justice, and freedom in Iran. And we do know that 80% of the Iranian people are opposed to the current regime. And he said that now this is Iran's Berlin Wall moment. So we'll have more updates on that in the coming hour. And that's a wrap on ILTV on the Hour, live from Israel and the Middle East. Stay with us for more updates on our new live ILTV channel. And you can also follow us on Screen IL with 24/7 live coverage. Thanks for watching and see you soon.